He does different topics at all these different places, and they're all great. So go to them.
Well, they're free, most of them.
And most of them are free.
No, they're not.
Most
Some
of
of
them.
them.
Not at Tales of Cape Cod, right, Ann?
Right? It's cheap, but it's good.
It's not easy.
Yeah. So go see Greg do stuff. Beyond that, we usually like to do a little spiel before we get going on these things, mostly to thank you for coming. Secondly, to tell you that there's bathrooms out there if you need them. Thirdly, to say the fire exit is right there or back there. The other things I want to mention is we have 2 upcoming programs that are going to be wicked awesome. If you're interested, you should totally come to them. The first is an evening of poetry with Chen Chen and John Banani. It's Tuesday, November 19th at 6:30. Chen Chen is a fairly younger poet. He's winning an insane amount of awards right now. He's been published in every poetry review a poet wants to get published in. He's the poet in residence at Brandeis. John Banani is a local poet. He's amazing. He also is published in every place you want to get published. He's the editor of Cape Cod Poetry Review, and he does different lectures and poetry classes around Cape Cod. If that's your thing, please show up. It's going to be great. Secondly, we have How to Shape Your Story, an evening with Julia Phillips, December 17th at 6 p.m. Julia is the author of Disappearing Earth, which has been nominated for a National Book Award, which is like one of the biggest book awards you can possibly get. She's also long-listed for the Center of Fiction First Novel Award. And she's going to do a bit of a reading, but she's also going to do a talk on how to plot your stories, how to plot a novel, how to work on developing your novel. And she has a very specific method that she uses. It's like a 7-step method, and she'll go through that with everyone. So if you're interested in learning to be a writer, if you're interested in hearing this award-nominated writer read, totally come to it. Going to be great. She's also got ties to people in Barnstable Village, so that's another cool connection. In case you haven't noticed, there's a bunch of alcohol on the back table. Please, at any point in time during this event...
Fine wines is really what it's called.
There we go. There's liquor. There's not actually liquor. But at any point in time, feel free to get up and refill your glass, whatever you want. It's Greg talking. You can just make noise and it'll be okay. There's also a donations jar back there. Sturgis, like all the other libraries in Barnstable, is 60% privately funded, 40% publicly funded, town funded, that's the way to phrase it. So we survive on stuff like donations and our book sales and the different fundraisers we do.
Oh, I was going to pass the basket on that.
Oh, you're going to pass the basket? Oh, Jesus. Do you have that made for tonight? That's fine, whatever makes you happy. So yeah, like I was saying, we rely on these kind of things to fund us and to give me a job and to buy books. But once again, libraries are an important part of the community. They should be free for all.
It's working so far, look.
Oh, don't feel pressured by Greg's box.
Just to show you.
But yeah, so libraries are supposed to be... So libraries are supposed to be this centerpiece of a community, and Sturgis is very much that. So we in no way want to like proselytize and be like, hey, give us your money. But if you feel like it, that would be great. Without further ado, Greg Williams.
I was going to start off with a joke. I was going to say something about me having ordered a Halloween costume from Amazon, but it hadn't come yet. And it was going to be, sexy something. But I couldn't really think of anything to fill it in with. But the first thing I thought was John Bolton. But then I thought that's probably in poor taste. So anyway, I was going to say that, but I'm not. The presentation tonight will consist of detailed analyses of statutes and case law of Britain and the United States from 1730 to 1890, encapsulating the state of the law concerning the extrajudicial disinterment of human remains. Kidding. But before we get to the grisly stuff, you actually came to hear some background. Although there can be some overlap, generally it's best to distinguish grave robbing from body snatching. Grave robbing, strictly speaking, is stealing objects from a place of interment. a grave or a tomb. And by objects, I mean things like jewelry and clothing, that kind of thing. It could be anything, really. Body snatching is exactly what it sounds like. The corpse itself is the object of the taking. It's also called resurrection, as in resurrection man or men, or resurrectionists, also known as sack-em-up men. Most people are familiar with body snatching in the context of creepy 18th or 19th century guys extracting corpses from graves in order to sell them to medical schools for anatomy instruction and surgical practice. Anybody not hear of that ever? Everybody's heard of that. Okay, we will get to that. Now, the term grave robbing did not really apply to the taking of corpses because robbing connotes the unlawful taking of property. But under the common law in Britain and then the United States, a corpse is not property. Doesn't have an owner. Might be indecent to take a corpse out of a grave, but it was not a crime for a long time. Taking objects, usually grave clothing, even a shroud from a grave, was a different matter. That was a serious crime that could get you transported from England to Australia. And my source for that is this.
19 crimes,
Right.
and one of them is number 16, stealing a shroud out of a grave.
There you go. Now, one instance when taking a corpse was legally prohibited centered on the motive for taking the corpse. Stealing a corpse for purposes of witchcraft was prohibited by law early in the 17th century in Britain, and then for a few years here in Massachusetts, starting in 1692. Anybody know the significance of that year? Salem witch trials. Okay. The penalty for stealing a dead body, or a part of a dead body, to be used, and I quote, in any manner of witchcraft, sorcery, charm, or enchantment, was death. Like anything else, pretty much. But by the late 18th century, the notion that removing a corpse from a grave was not criminal was changing. In 1788, an English defendant was convicted for taking a dead body out of a grave to dissect it. His counsel naturally pressed the argument that a corpse is not property, he cannot be prosecuted for this, but this time the court ignored the law of property and said common decency must prevent an act that is manifestly against the common good and repulsive. Now, I've got this broken, that was background. I've got this broken up into sections, and the next section is called Who Were the Bodies Being Snatched and Why? To state it differently, why did body snatching become as widespread as it did? Medical schools. In Europe by the early 18th century, and this was really generated and centered in Paris, teaching anatomy through dissection of corpses became a medical rite of passage and practice for more aggressive surgery. By the way, when it's lying there on the ground, it's a corpse. And even when you pull it out, it's a corpse. But when you get into a medical school and a bunch of young guys start carving on it, it's a cadaver. In Britain, medical schools were centered in London and in Edinburgh. That's where the great hospitals blossomed. They were followed by numerous private schools as instructors from the medical schools left the schools to set up their own businesses, private anatomy schools. One estimate is that more than 1,000 new medical students every year in London with another 700 in Edinburgh every year, early 19th century. It is suggested that surgical students had to participate in at least 4 or 5 dissections for the most basic competency. So you see the obvious problem. More medical students, more surgeons. Where do you obtain the necessary dissection subjects? The common law in Britain had long provided, this is going to get gruesome in a little while, just bear with me. The common law,
Yes, yes.
the common law in Britain had long provided, I just think you should have some background if you don't have it. The common law in Britain had long provided that only hanged murderers could be dissected. And the Murder Act of 1752, that you're probably familiar with, codified this practice in Britain and recognized, but that's the real importance, or I should say the cool part of that statute, is that it recognized that sentencing somebody to hang might not be deemed harsh enough. And so what we should do is add to that death sentence a post-mortem sentence. After you're hanged, and the common phrase was turned off, and you're cut down from the gallows, and this was something that was said right there in the courtroom, never got a chance to say that, but say this, but probably cool. You will be publicly dissected. Ooh. Getting there, right? People in the 18th, 19th centuries generally viewed dissection with horror and revulsion. And for religious people, it was even worse because there was some belief to the effect that, if your body's all sliced up, might not let you into heaven in that condition. So that was a whole nother layer of consternation for a lot of people. So this post-mortem sentence provided a terrifying psychological torment, at least theoretically. And for the public, at least theoretically, an added layer of deterrence. For the 80 years from the passage of the Murder Act in 1752 until 1832, about 80% of the 1,150 executed murderers in England, say 920 bodies, 80% of 1150 is roughly 920 bodies, I think. Don't check, please. Received a post-mortem sentence of dissection. But that averages only to about 11, 12 available cadavers a year. Clearly inadequate. And federal law provided much the same thing here in the United States in 1780. But corpses other than those of hanged murderers generally became available and gradually became available. Maybe criminals executed for other offenses. Beginning of the 19th century in England, there were 222 crimes for which you could be executed. But really, there was really only a realistic possibility of your being hanged in about 17 of those crimes. Still a lot. In the United States, in 1831, Massachusetts became the first state to allow dissection of unclaimed bodies of state wards, prisons, state hospitals, workhouses. And the year after that, followed by, in Britain, called the Anatomy Act. But again, the number of legally provided corpses, never enough. So, most corpses in Britain who ended up in the hands of body snatchers had been poor or powerless people. And in the United States, most people who ended up in the hands of body snatchers were poor, powerless, and black. Black people were people who could not really be heard to complain about their corpses becoming commodities because they were commodities when they were alive. So, the Times created corpses. A lot of people are dying. There's a lot of disease in big cities. Cholera was a big disease that periodically visited cities like London, Edinburgh, New York. Times created corpses. Medical schools provided the market for corpses. We need suppliers. Who were the body snatchers? Here we go. In the early years of Britain and American anatomy teaching, most body snatchers were gentlemen. Medical students themselves, or at least hospital porters, often in league with graveyard watchers. Watchmen, I should say. Not very many women took up that occupation, probably. Close to home example. In 1999, the basement of Holden Chapel at Harvard was being renovated. And within a dry well there were found numerous human bones. Holden, it turned out, was Harvard Medical School's medical laboratory from 1782 until about 1850. Some early students started an organization called the Anatomical Club, better known as Spunkers. I wasn't going to say this. For the love of God, do not look up Spunkers on the internet. Seriously, don't. Don't. I know. Somebody's probably doing it right now. I know. The purpose, don't read it. If you do look it up, don't read it out loud. The purpose of this club was to obtain corpses for class. They prided themselves on evading capture and leaving a grave that they had raided appearing undisturbed. The members of the Spunkers included Dr. John Warren, who was the founder of Harvard Medical School, and also a gentleman named Samuel Adams, Jr., Sam Adams' son. As the practice burgeoned in the 19th century, that is body snatching and grave robbing, but mostly body snatching, it was taken over, especially in Britain, by professionals, resurrection men. Gangs arose, fairly small gangs, but well organized, such as one called the London Borough Gang, that flourished from about 1802 to 1825, peaked at 6 members. Body snatchers were usually considered the lowest of low criminals. Dylan Thomas wrote a screenplay in the very early 1950s called The Doctor and the Devils, which we'll refer to again in a few minutes. And the character of the anatomy doctor in that screenplay says at one point, "I regard the resurrectionists as the vicious human vermin of the gutters of the city. In fact, a pack of devils. But as the law says no to the need of progressive science, so up crawl these creatures to satisfy that need against the law. The same applies to every city, though ours is rather more fortunate than most. It is full of perverted blackguards." Now, blackguards or not, resurrection men could make considerable money. Remember, when we said bodies were not property and had no value, they did now. One group of London body snatchers testified that in the year 1809 to 1810, they sold 305 adults, or as they were called in the trade, larges, and 44 children, or as they were called in the trade, smalls. And for that work, they made 1,328 guineas, which is more than a pound and a shilling, right? Plus whatever they got for teeth. That's a different market. You don't want to know. Trying to convert 19th century monetary values into contemporary ones is, as Victorian historians constantly warn, complicated and usually futile, but this gang made good money. And it's worth saying, too, that in an age when alcoholism was rife, really could be any time. But it was particularly endemic in urban Britain and in the United States in the 18th and the early 19th century, actually most of the 19th century, all right, the 20th and the 21st. But we're really talking about the 18th and the early 19th century. The prevalence and the severity of that disease among body snatchers was noteworthy. Like gangs in all eras, these resurrectionist gangs fought each other. They ratted out rivals to the police. The police were a pretty embryonic organization back in the early part of the 19th century. They sought to establish monasteries by creating markets with particular medical schools. They had turf battles. Do you get it? Turf battles?
Yeah.
Okay. They sometimes tried to sabotage each other. One gang would enter a graveyard associated with another gang, and they would wreck it. They would dig up graves, they would pull out the coffins, they would have the bodies kind of lying all over the place and prop the coffins up against the wall, that kind of thing. All in an attempt to create outrage among the public and to create increased efforts at watchmen watching those particular graveyards. Next section, how to snatch a body. Now, this is maybe what you wanted to learn most this evening. It's not career advice necessarily, but a matter of curiosity. Exactly how do you snatch a body that has been buried? Or at least how was it done in the 19th century? Get a little distance. Although I did bring a shovel. We'll do that later. First, a few words about the body that you're after. Probably obvious. Fresher the better. Embalming, which retards the decomposition of bodies, did not really come in until later in the 19th century. In the United States, it mostly came in as a result of the Civil War. Union soldiers killed in the South, that's where the battlefields were, and families wanted to bring those bodies back to the North. The embalming trade, explosive. That's how embalming really got started. So, what you need to keep in mind is bodies begin to decompose within minutes of death. Start of the first stage of decomposition is called autolysis. Internal organs start decomposing within 24 to 72 hours. All this is heavily dependent on numerous factors: moisture, the weather generally, clothing, how deep somebody's buried. So if you can get in there on the first night, that's the best. Somebody gets buried, you're in there that night. That's what you want to do. That's what you're looking for. First few days, certainly before the second stage of decomposition, which is called bloat. Okay. 3 to 5 days, maybe longer, somebody's underground. Obviously unpleasant. Earlier the better. Decomposition of corpses is one reason why there is a snatching season. It was not done, generally speaking, in the summer, and that's when the medical schools went out in session anyway. They usually didn't get cranked up until about this time of the year, October into November. So it's like being a teacher. They had the summers off. Now, graves are like any other kind of real estate. Location, location, location. You want the grave that you're going after to be as hidden from view as possible. You want to do it at the nighttime. Heightened atmospherics, certainly, but the real reason is practical. As noted, cracking open graves is illegal, at least by the late 18th century, and your chances of prosecution are not that high. The law is not that interested in prosecuting these people. It certainly did happen, but it was not something that the law the police, the government were that interested in prosecuting. Fines were common. Somebody might get incarcerated every once in a while. But that's not your real worry. More of a problem is you're being attacked by a mob. And that could end in your maiming or your own death. You want to avoid that. The populace hated body snatching. And a mob, especially in cities, could ignite for almost any reason, especially if the members of that mob can feel righteously indignant, which they can with body snatchers, given the supposed sanctity of grave sites. London particularly, I mean, there are books about what is known in London as the mob. And of course, that was a big feature of the early days of the American Revolution in Boston. You do not want to confront a mob of dozens of angry people. Now, you might get tipped off about an upcoming burial or a recent burial from a sexton or a graveyard watchman. You might have a gang member or the wife of a gang member attend the funeral with the idea of casing the situation. It's not like they've got all that much to do in the daytime. So you might have somebody go to the funeral and he, she might join mourners at the funeral, get a close-up look at the grave, the orientation of the grave, make it easier to find in the dark, the depth of the grave, which is almost never going to be 6 feet, by the way. A lot less than that. We'll get to that. Some sources will tell you that this was an opportunity for someone to conduct reconnaissance on the grave, and it would be helpful in noting the placement of booby traps, such as spring guns that are set off by tripping over a wire and that kind of thing. That is highly unlikely. We'll get to this in a little bit more detail, but unless you're going after the grave of a moneyed individual, people don't have the money for that kind of thing. There aren't going to be spring guns and that sort of stuff. But again, we'll talk about it in a minute. Generally optimal, 3 body snatchers. We got one with the cart. You want to have a cart. It's just going to make it easier. You're going to have the other 2 body snatchers at the grave. You want what's called a dark lantern. It's a lantern that is shaded. You know how you can buy these lights now that are dark sky friendly? You want one of those, a dark lantern. Again, you don't want that light in the graveyard mob. The other equipment you're going to want to take with you is 2 tarps, or sheets if you can't get a tarp, an auger, a rope, and my favorite thing, maybe the hook. We'll get to that. Now the shovel, I mean, I brought this in for illustration purposes in case none of you had ever seen a shovel. You don't want this. You don't want to take one of these. Why? That thing hits stones. It's like, mob, come on. No. You want a wooden shovel or specially made sort of short dagger-shaped wooden implements. They're wooden and they're pointed. You want one with a little handle on it. Would be good. You don't want that metal on stone noise. Now before you start digging, you might want to use one of the tarps and the hook, we'll get to that, to create a tent. Gives you that much more protection with the light. Before you start digging on the grave, you want to check the surface of the grave site to check for patterns of stones and sticks that somebody might lay out. So when they come back in a day or so, if they see that that pattern is disturbed, they'll know that somebody has snatched the body out of there. People are tricky, and you have to get your way around that. So you want to look for that, and if there is a pattern of sticks, stones, or shells, people could get shells, I guess, you want to make sure you remember what that pattern is so you can recreate it. Going to lay the tarp on the ground. You want to uncover the head of the grave with a hole about a yard square. dumping the dirt on the tarp. Coffin's usually going to be about 4 feet down, tops, maybe less. So, the dirt should be loose unless these clever bastards had put some big stones in there to hinder your progress in getting to the coffin. You want to watch out for that. Put some large stones in there just to make it harder for you to get to the coffin. Break through the coffin lid at the head by boring a row of holes with the auger. You don't want to just break it open. That would be crude. It would be tasteless, really, and you don't want that. You want to use that auger. It's going to be pretty silent. So you're going to get that thing open, and then you're going to see, with any luck at all, unless you were beaten by one of the other gangs, you're going to see the head and shoulders of the corpse in there. Then you're going to want to affix, if you have the equipment, and if you're any kind of a decent gang, you will. You want to affix a harness under the arms. There'll be a ring on the back of the harness, and you're going to put the rope through there, and that way you can pull the person out that way. Out of the, right, you know, you're pulling them out of there like a cork out of a bottle, kind of, like a mussel out of a shell. Kind of. I mean, it's a little bit different. Or if you don't have that harness, you can just, you know, try to tie them up underneath the arms, or just around the neck, whatever. Around the chin, maybe, if it's a light one. But that's what you want to do. And this is where, if you really got a semi-sophisticated gang, you're going to have the hook. The hook is an iron bar about 5 feet long with a crossbar handle on one end and a blunt hook on the other end. You're going to place the hook under the chin. I love it when people come to talks about body snatching and then go, ooh. It's good, though. It's good. It's what I want. So you're going to put the hook under the chin, and two of you are going to pull that body out of there and onto the second tarp. Now, is the hook going to damage the person's chin and the roof of the mouth? Yes! Now, more fastidious, sensitive, sophisticated body snatchers might do this. An alternative method. Not going to go in through the top of the grave site. They're going to cut a hole 15 or 20 feet away from the head of the grave and dig a tunnel and meet the end of the coffin. You're going to pull off the end and then extract the body down the tunnel. Seems like a lot of trouble. But when the turf is, turf battles, turf? When the turf is replaced over the hole, 15 feet away or so, the grave, and you don't even have to worry about the pattern of stones or anything, the grave appears completely unviolated. So anybody who checks on it the next day is not going to notice that small disturbance 15 feet away, unless they step on it. Now, whatever method you use once you have the body out of there, you're going to strip it off, obviously. And whatever clothing the body has on, whatever shroud the body might be covered with, take that off and stuff it back down in the grave. For a couple of reasons. First of all, it might help with the positive ID of the body later on, should the medical school get raided. And might get tied to you somehow. You don't want that. More importantly than that, you don't want to expose yourself to the felony of grave robbing, of stealing something, even a shroud, right? It's right there on the cork. All right? Plus, the coffins could be stacked, probably are stacked, especially in poor graveyards. So, you know, you don't want to get involved in that. You should be able to accomplish all this in about an hour. Then you tie the body up in the tarp, put the body in the cart. You're off to the hospital. You deliver the body to the porter before it gets light out, before the sun comes up. Price with the porter is going to be adjusted for the size and condition of the corpse. And average going rate for a corpse during the what I like to call the golden age of body snatching is probably something in the neighborhood of 9 pounds, 11 shillings. It's good money. It's good money. It's well worth your hour of labor. Even if you're investing some money in the hook, it's still worth it. Now, what you're not going to do when you're out there, and you've already been looking at these slides, and you've probably seen this depicted a couple of times, you are not going to dig up the coffin, the whole thing, pull it up and put it on the ground. Why would you do that? It's too much work, and this is really when coffin stacking becomes a problem. You know, there's a coffin probably underneath there. You don't know how long that thing has been there. If it's been there a while, you want to avoid that at all costs. It's way beyond bloat, probably. It's like these guys right here. They're taking a, why would you do that? Stay away from it. Body underneath there. If it's skeletonized, if the body's in the last stages of decomposition, it's skeletonized, that's fine. But before that, no. Next section, public animosity against body snatching in medical schools and the 1788 New York doctors' riot. Short section. As I said before, the public hated resurrectionists. They distrusted medical school because they knew they were in business with resurrectionists. There were acts of vigilante justice against medical schools frequently during the late 18th century, the early 19th century. The New York doctors' riot of 1788 illustrates the fragility of the status of medical schools and, once again, the segregationist, racist policies that I referred to earlier. By the end of the American Revolution, about 20% of New York City was black, mostly slaves. And they were buried outside the city limits, but as fate would have it, close to the only medical school in New York, which was a precursor of Columbia University. That ground was periodically raided for bodies. And regarding that, there was general indifference, because after all, these people were black. Who cares? That was the thought at the time. But in 1788, some kids were playing outside the New York hospital, and they saw a medical student dissecting the arm of a white person. And the student saw the kid looking at him and picked up the arm and waved it at him and said, "This arm is your mother's." And indeed it was. Recently buried. The boy reported this outrage to his father. Father had the wife's grave opened. It was empty. The father gathered some supporters. They invaded the school. They found several other bodies in various stages of dissection. The mob grew to about 2,000 people. The ensuing riot lasted several days, quelled only by the state militia. At least 3 rioters were killed. At least 3 militiamen were killed. And there may have been as many as 20 people killed in this riot. Next section. Fear of dissection and mechanisms to avoid disinterment. We're getting there. It's going to get grisly in a little while. Body snatching was, as I mentioned before, greatly feared, and it was certainly feared by anyone who buried and had buried a loved one. Losing a family member's body obviously inflicts profound psychological pain, maybe especially acute with children, despite the frequency of infant mortality, infant death. In 1830, London, 150 out of every 1,000 children died before the age of 5. 15%. And that's, by the way, that's why when you're reading and somebody says in a history book, Oh, the average age then was 40 or 50. It's because the average is driven down by infant mortality. That's why. Which was definitely a real thing. Now, several stratagems were employed, or at least available, to reduce the chance of having your loved one snatched. And as usual, though, only people with money could entertain any of them. Additionally, as already noted, the grave sites of many people were subject to repeated use, so many devices were unavailable on that account. Many of these devices were low-tech. Probably one of the most effective ones was to hire a grave watcher. Maybe that guy is armed. You want him out there at least 10 nights, maybe a little longer than 10 nights, because you want the body to start deliquescing a little bit, make it less appealing to body snatchers in medical schools. Problem with that kind of an arrangement is the person could be subject to bribes, could also be subject to violence. Might not be 100% effective. Some graveyards had watch towers, though how faithfully those were manned is unknown. Some graveyards had mort houses, circular, essentially the vaults that we have. Keep the corpses long enough for them to be decomposed, and in places like New England, stone vaults with iron doors. Also here, avoid frozen ground. Don't want to be out there digging ground, or digging up a grave. I mean, legitimately digging up a grave in the frozen ground if you can help it. There was a thing, and I've got a couple of pictures that come up here every once in a while, called a mort safe. This was invented in 1816. It was especially popular in Scotland. It is a riveted grill of iron bars covering the grave, and it's deeply anchored in the ground. Removal of one of those mort safes is extremely difficult, and that's why you can still see them, because nobody's bothered to take them out of there. There are some graveyards in Scotland that have them still. A couple of years later, you could buy yourself an iron coffin. A lot of fun, but heavy to carry. You don't want to be a pallbearer in a ceremony where the person had an iron coffin. And they probably had a regular coffin. They probably had like a paper mache coffin or something that you could take down there, and then somebody else who was being paid some decent money got the iron coffin to the graveyard. I'm just guessing on that. The most dramatic I've already referred to were devices such as coffin guns or spring guns, which is a firearm set so that somebody trips a wire, they're out there and starting to dig the grave, they trip a wire, the gun goes off and somebody gets shot. You know, that might have probably happened once in all of history. Who knows? But that was certainly advertised. I have to say, I went to law school in the South, and one of the first cases was, this has got nothing to do with body snatching. But one of the first cases you read in law school, or at least you did when I went a long time ago, was about a spring gun. And it was a case from Iowa. And the whole case was about a farmer who set up a spring gun on some of his outbuildings to prevent people from stealing antique bottles out of his outbuildings. So he set up a spring gun and had it aimed about belt high, and his wife said, "Come on, have a little compassion." So he lowered it a little bit. And a guy broke in to steal some bottles, and it was a shotgun, and it went off and blew one of the guy's legs off. And the teaching of the case is that you cannot use deadly force to protect property. Did I say I went to school in the South? 3/4 of the class went, "Well, that's bullshit." Why not? Of course you can. He was on that guy's land. A couple of people were from the north and said, "Well, I get it." Anyway, I wasn't going to tell that one, but there you go. Later on, say 1870, 1880, in the United States, appeared advertisements for something, you're going to love this, and it's a great name for a rock band, coffin torpedo. This is a shell. I love this. There's a shell that would be wired either inside the coffin or on top of the coffin, and if it were disturbed, it would detonate. And this was really advertised. It's fun to think about, but probably used very, very little, if at all. But it did prey on people's fears of body snatching and their desire to have a decent, peaceful burial. How the exploding coffin has not been made the centerpiece of a Quentin Tarantino movie. I just don't know. I don't know. Okay, now we're going to get to it. The golden age of body snatching. Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. Anybody ever heard of Burke and Hare? A few Burke and Hare aficionados over here? Okay, good. Edinburgh, like London, center of anatomical study in 19th century Britain. In Edinburgh, you had the university, which at this particular time featured a professor named Alexander Monroe, who was notoriously dull. Third generation anatomy teacher. As probably a direct result of these Monroes, several private schools sprang up, and one of them, there's Burke and Hare right there. One of these schools was run by a gentleman called Dr. Robert Knox. He was by far the most popular anatomy professor in Edinburgh at the time. He was a celebrity lecturer. He was a showman. He was immaculately dressed, frills, lace. He had a diamond ring, very flamboyant, very witty. Medical students loved to see and hear Dr. Knox. There's a mort safe. Any discussion of body snatching must include Burke and Hare, although they only snatched one body. And that body was not even from a graveyard. We'll get to it in a minute. They were not really body snatchers, but they were serial killers. They were the most famous serial killers in Britain before Jack the Ripper in August to November 1888. Both of them were William Burke, William Hare, both Irish, lived in Edinburgh. Burke was kind of a part-time cobbler, seller of secondhand clothes, lived with his wife, Helen McDougall, M''Dougal, in a room of a tenement. And by the way, a room of a tenement in Edinburgh at that time was referred to as your house room. Hare lived with his wife, Margaret. They owned a kind of a lodging house in a street called Tanner's Close, or Close, and that becomes relevant, Tanner's Close. You could obtain accommodation at reasonable rates at the Hare establishment. For example, for only threepence a night, you might obtain a straw pallet, but maybe you would only get a third of a bed. And I don't think you were able really to pick the other two people in the bed. But for threepence, what do you think? What do you expect? In November 1827, Hare's lodger, a gentleman called either Dougal or Donald, I prefer Donald, died of dropsy, owing Hare £4 in back rent. Burke had an idea. Parish paid for Donald's burial, including the coffin, and it came time when Burke and Hare were left alone with the coffin. So they took Donald's body out, and they tucked it under the bed, and they filled the coffin with bark from the local tanners. Tanner's Close? Tanners? So once the coffin was removed, they searched for Professor Monroe, but they ran into a med student before they got to Monroe, and he directed them to Dr. Knox. Donald thereby became a subject. They were astounded. They were overjoyed to receive for Donald's body 7 pounds, 10 shillings. That is 5 to 6 months' pay for an unskilled laborer at the time. And just to scale it a different way, it might take a migrant agricultural worker at the time 3 years to make 10 pounds. 3 seasons, 3 harvests. A couple of months later, still living off the earnings of Dougal or Donald, another one of Hare's lodgers became ill. Hare was concerned that that person's illness might deter other potential lodgers, or so sensitive, thought it was unseemly for that person to remain on the premises with possible cholera symptoms. So Burke and Hare now become a real team. It is sometimes said that one of them would smother the person with a pillow while the other person held their legs down. It is more probable that one of them would lay on a person's chest to compress respiration while the other person held their nose and mouth closed. It's going to get easier to do when they're intoxicated, and that's going to happen every single time. So, either way, another corpse / cadaver, Dr. Knox, 10 pounds for this one. Knox was pleased and said so at so fresh a specimen. Probably warm. Yeah, fresh. Now the corpses Knox had been used to receiving at least had a little dirt on them, presumably, they having been buried and then excavated. But he was apparently unbothered by the lack of dirt, whatever, on this body and on Dougal. Now the moment you've been waiting for. Audience participation. Can I have a vote? No. I know you guys love poems. You love quatrains. Lizzie Borden has her own quatrain. We're not going to get into that one because we have a new one. It's even better. And here it goes. I'm going to say the line, and then I want you to repeat it. First line. Up the alley, down the stair.
Up the alley, down the stair.
In and out with Burke and Hare.
In and out with Burke and Hare.
Now, somebody said with. I didn't say with. I said with. W-I apostrophe, with. Let's do it again. Up the alley, down the stair.
Up the alley, down the stair.
In and out with Burke and Hare.
In and out with Burke and Hare.
Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief.
Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief.
Knox the boy that buys the beef.
Knox the boy that buys the beef.
This pattern develops. Burke is the more personable of the two, which you wouldn't be able to tell from that picture. He would invite somebody home for a drink, and once they were stupefied with alcohol, which, let's face it, most people were anyway all the time, Burke and Hare would begin. Burke and Hare murdered at least 16 people within about 10 months. And they would sell them to Knox for between 8 and 10 pounds. Twice they chose victims who were young and fairly well-known people in Edinburgh. The first one was prostitute Mary Patterson, and the second one was a physically, mentally handicapped street character, low-level entrepreneur, early 20s, named James Wilson, known then and forever as Daft Jamie. No reaction to that at all. So sensitive. Okay. Accounts differ why the dissecting students did not balk when these easily recognizable corpses were presented to them for dissection. And one is that they were indeed recognized, but people died of alcohol-related causes all the time, so what the heck? Here's Mary and Daft Jamie. There's been another theory regarding Jamie, who was really very well known. He had some kind of deformed feet, and he possibly had club feet, so he might have been presented to students in such a fashion that he would not be recognized because his head and his feet were elsewhere. In any event, Burke and Hare started to become sloppy, so things got worse. The last victim was an Irish woman named Margaret Maggie Doherty, apparently sometimes pronounced Darty. She is usually described as elderly. She was in her 40s. Burke met her in a pub and convinced her that they were relatives, distant relatives, but relatives from Ireland. She returned home with him. What night was it?
Halloween.
Halloween. So party. They had a party, and they did. And Maggie had a drink or two. The Burkes had guests. Helen's relatives, there was a couple named Gray. They were asked to stay over at Hare's lodging house for the night, which they were a little reluctant to do, and they thought, all right, we're getting thrown out because we're not Irish, and they're going to have a Halloween party, and they're all Irish. Okay, we got it, so we're going. And that's what they did. And they got back to Burke's in the morning, and they asked, well, where's Maggie? And they were told that Maggie had been turned out because she had grown boisterous. And Burke could not resist saying, she's quiet enough now. Oh, by the way, Grays, do not poke around that whiskey-soaked pile of straw at the foot of the bed, which is pretty much the same as saying, why don't you poke around in that whiskey-soaked straw as soon as we leave the premises? So they did not poke around in that straw long before they found the naked corpse of Maggie. They were shocked, and they reported this discovery to Mrs. Hare, assuming she would also be appalled. No. She offered them a few shillings, and then she said, starting the following week, I will give you 10 pounds a week to forget about the straw. A week. This was a fortune. To their credit, they did not bite on that offer. They went to the police. The police arrived, and when they got there, no Maggie. There were some blood stains around. Maggie had bled out of her mouth and out of her nose. But they knew where to look. Straight to Dr. Knox's. The Burkes and the Hares were swiftly arrested. Now, forensic science was all but non-existent in the 1820s. And proving that this frail, elderly, probably alcoholic Maggie had been smothered or otherwise murdered was pretty much impossible. And the other victims of Burke and Hare's enterprise were unavailable. So the decision was made to arrange for Hare to turn king's evidence, and he received immunity. I have a footnote here that I wasn't going to read, but I just love this. The king at the time was George IV. We all know George III, right? Bad man. Supposedly, whatever. This was his son, George IV. He was the king of Britain from 1820 to 1830. 2 months before he died of various, mostly overindulgence-related ailments, he had gout, arteriosclerosis, peripheral edema, probably porphyria, which his father certainly had, Plus he was blind from cataracts. The Duke of Wellington had breakfast with the king and noted the following. This is what the king had for breakfast. It's got nothing to do with body snatching. Quote from the Duke of Wellington. A pigeon and beefsteak pie, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy. And then he took a large dose of laudanum. Now, if you're going to be the king, what the hell? You're not going to get fired. 2 months later, though, he was dead. I just love that. Anyway, so as I said, Hare turns king's evidence. He receives immunity. His evidence supports indictments against Burke and Ms. McDougall for the murders of Patterson, Wilson, Daft Jamie, and Maggie. And that was it. Murder was Halloween. They don't have any Thanksgiving in Britain. When are we going to have the trial? Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So, jury convicted Burke in 50 minutes. Now, in Scottish law, there is a third possible verdict besides guilty or not guilty. And it is called not proven. And what it means is not guilty, but don't do it again. McDougall got that. Burke got convicted, hanged, dissected. When he was hanged on January 28th, 1828, drew a carnival-like crowd of about 25,000 people. A couple of pictures up here depict, still public hanging until in Britain until 1868, which is a long time before they stopped doing it here. Last public hanging in the United States was in Kentucky in 1936, and it was a mess up. Anyway, so he gets hanged, and then he goes to get dissected by Professor Monroe, the man to whom they wanted to sell Donald. So many students wanted tickets that groups of 50 came in and were allowed to pass through and stay for a few moments into the dissecting theater, and then they had to move on. And while that was going on, Monroe dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." Unquote. The cadaver was then displayed for a day to as many as 30,000 people. And his skull is still on display at Edinburgh Medical School. And also on view is his death mask and an example of anthropodermic bibliophagy, book bound in human skin. Skin is Burke's. And incidentally, probably the most famous of such volumes is housed 70.2 miles from this building. Boston Athenaeum, 10.5 Beacon Street, has a 40-page book, the short title of which is Narrative of the Life of James Allen, alias George Walton. Mr. Allen died in Charlestown Prison in 1837, made a deathbed confession, and asked that one copy of that document be bound in his own skin. And they did.
What did he confess to?
What did he confess to? I think he just wanted a book bound in his skin. And the interesting thing about the book is that it was tanned. It's gray, and it was tanned to make it look like deerskin. Well, what the hell is the point of that? If you're going to have human skin, let's see it, right? He confessed he was he wasn't a murderer. I'm trying to think what the heck he was. I think he was like a highwayman, kind of a thing. You know, still during the time when you can be hanged for almost anything. What the heck? Just hang him. But and that's what happened. Now, what happened to Hare and his wife? They're free. Is the stuff of rumor, if not legend. And one of the nastier rumors is that he got a job that involved lime, and his coworkers found out who he was and threw him into the trough of lime, which blinded him. And he ended up being a blind street beggar in London for 40 years. Burke and Hare, I think there's a show on right now, it might be on Netflix. It's about Burke and Hare. It has that guy, I can't think of his name, but anyway, there's still, there are a lot of works created about Burke and Hare. Among the more literary works inspired by Burke and Hare was the Dylan Thomas screenplay that I referred to earlier, which is actually quite good. And there was a movie made out of that, starring, among other people, Timothy Dalton.
Oh, I love him.
Who said that? He's great. He's also in Penny Dreadful, if you ever watched that. Penny Dreadful's a great series. He's in that. So that was one, Dylan Thomas. But also Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a story called The Body-Snatcher. And I'm not stripping all the way off. Not for the money you people paid. But I did want to show you my shirt. And it even says Robert Louis Stevenson right on it. And this was a movie with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, made in 1945. As a result of the infamy of Burke and Hare, murdering somebody to sell their body for a cadaver became known as Burking. And then the definition expanded to include simply suffocating somebody. And you see that a lot in the literature. Some people are afraid of getting burked. Not haired, but burked. And as a result of the burkings in the UK, Great Britain, Parliament passed the Reforming Anatomical Act of 1832 that I referred to earlier, making more corpses available. Now we're going to move away from the traditional medical school thing for a little bit because the next section is called Museums and a Crochet. So beyond medical research and training, bodies and body parts, again, mostly of the poor and outcast, might be displayed in an anatomical museum. There were 39 anatomical museums founded in England between 1739 and 1800. The most famous one of those was created by a gentleman named Dr. John Hunter. There is a quite good book about him called The Knife Man. He was the most famous London surgeon of the late 18th century. And he had in his museum 10,500 specimens. But the centerpiece was the skeleton of a gentleman named Charles Byrne, better known as the Irish Giant. Charles Byrne, it is estimated from his skeleton, was 7'7". He was advertised as being 8'3". That probably would. That's a giant, right? 7'7" is just a basketball player. But anyway, he was the Irish Giant. He died when he was 22. He knew that Hunter wanted his skeleton, and he tried to avoid that outcome. And the way he tried to avoid that was by arranging to have his body buried at sea. And so when he died at the age of 22, and he was being transported down to Margate so he could be buried at sea, body-snatchers that Hunter had hired snatched his body before it could be taken and dumped into the sea. He paid those people 500 pounds. But he did get the Irish Giant still on display in London. Although there is a movement afoot to have him taken off of that display, and I'm proud to say that that movement is largely being generated from Queen Mary College, the University of London, which is where I went. There are some people there who are trying to say that this is just wrong, and let's let's get the guy out of the museum. A little late, but still. Bodies could also end up as models for what was called an écorché figure. This is a cast from a body that has been flayed. And by that I mean stripped of skin, fat, interstitial material to whatever depth you want in order to display the musculature of a person. These casts were made from dead bodies, used as artist models, displayed in galleries, sculptures and paintings. You can go online and see these. Just don't look up Spunker, God. But,
I did.
you did?
And did.
Oh.
It was disgusting.
I knew it would be you.
If-
I knew it would be you.
If this gets subpoenaed, you're in trouble.
I should never have said that.
No, terrible.
And I tell myself when I get up here, I'm not going to say these things, but then I do. Which is why you probably come. But the most famous écorché figure was created from the body of a hanged smuggler. A gentleman who was, I believe, 77, 78 years old when he was hanged. And that figure is known as Smugglerius. It's kind of classical. All right, famous body snatching incidents. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin married Una in 1943. He was 54. She was 18. Charlie! Anyway, they moved to Switzerland, and there was a Cape Cod connection. Does anybody know what the Cape Cod connection is?
Her father,
Her father.
Eugene O'Neill.
Her father was Eugene O'Neill. Provincetown.
Oh, that's right.
Very good. There was another Cape connection. Or there is another Cape connection. It's got nothing to do with this. But I still wanted to get it in here. You know the 1959 original movie, Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
Yes.
And you know the star of that movie was? Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah.
Kevin McCarthy died in 2010 at the age of 96 in Cape Cod Hospital. Anyway, Charlie and Una moved to Switzerland near Lake Geneva. This was all about Charlie, you know, supposed to be a communist. And he said, you know what, fine, I'm a communist, whatever you want to call me. I'm not going back to the United States. I'm moving to Switzerland, which he did. He died on Christmas Day, 1977, at the age of 88, and he was buried in a cemetery near his home. And in May of 1978, his coffin was stolen. Got a picture of it up here. And the thieves soon demanded the equivalent of about $600,000 for the return of Charlie Chaplin's body and coffin. And Una reasoned that Charlie would have thought it rather ridiculous. So Una did nothing. But it soon came to the notice of the police. They mounted an extensive operation. They tapped Una's phone. They watched 200 area telephone kiosks, and it didn't take them long to catch the miscreants who had perpetuated this deed. Two political refugee auto mechanics, a gentleman from Poland named Roman Wardas, and a gentleman from Bulgaria named Ganshu Ganev. They were apprehended. They led police to Charlie's temporary grave, which was in a cornfield about a mile from his house. They were prosecuted for grave robbing, because they took a coffin, I guess. I don't know what Swiss law is, whatever. And attempted extortion. Wardas was sentenced to 4.5 years hard labor, and Ganev got 18 months suspended. They both wrote letters of apology to Una. Una wrote back to them with forgiveness. Charlie was reburied, encased in reinforced concrete. Abraham Lincoln attempted, just briefly noting this failed and ludicrously inept plot to steal Lincoln's body. 1876. Lincoln, as you know, had been murdered in April 1865. In 1876, this is the real reason I'm telling you this one, Chicago counterfeiter Big Jim Kennelly wanted the body to exchange it for his engraver, being pardoned. His engraver was doing 10 years in Joliet. Also, if you could throw in $200,000, that'd be good. About $5 million today. The two gang members who were tapped to do this job recruited a third guy. He was a paid Secret Service informant. When they got to the unguarded sarcophagus housing Abraham Lincoln's coffin, they realized they had no plan to move the 500-pound cedar and copper coffin. There were cops who had been tipped off all over the place. Some cop's gun went off. Those guys panicked. They took off. They went back to the saloon where the Secret Service knew they would be, and they were arrested 2 days later. Speaking of presidents, only one person has ever been the son of one president and the father of another. Don't look it up, Ann. I know what you're doing. A gentleman named John Scott Harrison. His picture shows up here every once in a while. His father, William Henry Harrison, was the 9th president of the United States, and he was the father of Benjamin Harrison, who was the 23rd president of the United States. More to our point, he was the subject of what was probably the biggest American body snatching scandal. He died in North Bend, Ohio. Anybody here from North Bend? Anybody ever heard of North Bend? Anybody ever heard of Ohio?
Every election.
There you go. 1878, he was 73 years old. Funeral mourners noticed that the nearby grave, a young gentleman named Augustus Devon, had died 11 days earlier. That grave was disturbed. He was gone. Benjamin Harrison, not president yet, his two brothers wanted to ensure that John Scott Harrison's grave would be left undisturbed and be robbery-proof. They placed a large stone slab over the top 2/3 of his body, smaller one over his legs, and they paid a watchman $30 to watch the grave for a month. And the day after John Scott Harrison's funeral, son John, a cousin, traveled to Cincinnati to find the body of Augustus Devon. Why Cincinnati? Ohio Medical College. The police went with them with search warrants. Apparently, in those days, a hunch was good enough to get you a search warrant. And no evidence the guy was actually there. Coming up, one of my favorite parts. A newspaper in Cincinnati reported one day that early that morning, a buggy had driven into the alley next to the medical school. Quote from the newspaper. Something white was taken out and disappeared before the buggy, quote, left rapidly. Quote, the general impression created was that a stiff was being smuggled into the Ohio Medical College. Sanctity of the body? A stiff? You're gonna put that? So these guys show up, they search the school, they find boxes of body parts all over the place, otherwise undescribed. Student was chipping away at a cadaver of a woman. There was a body of a 6-month-old child lying, so they saw all this. And finally, the janitor who had let them in obedience to the subpoena, that was done in those days, slunk off, and a police officer followed him upstairs to the opening of a shaft with a windlass and a rope. The rope was taut. The officer cranked the windlass, and up through the shaft appeared the naked body of a man hanging by his neck. His head was covered by cloth, looked like an older man in good shape, not the emaciated 23-year-old Augustus Devon. Harrison lifted the cloth. It was his father. And it turned out that body snatchers had drilled into Harrison's casket at the feet by which he'd been extracted. The They had known to avoid the heavier stone slab that covered the top 2/3 of his body. Obviously questioned was the hired watchman. He knew nothing about it. Devon's body later was found, literally pickled, with 39 other corpses in a vat of brine at the medical school of the University of Michigan. Go Wolverines. People were outraged by what became known as the Harrison Horror. 5 Midwestern states passed anatomy acts, increasing penalties for this crime, and they also permitted medical schools to dissect the unclaimed bodies of, again, wards of state, thus theoretically obviating the need for body snatching. But enforcement was not vigorous. Supply still lagged behind demand. Finally, this is the sordid case of Ed Gein.
I love Ed too.
Well, I am not going into detail. And that more recent of Amador Medina. Body snatching for medical schools faded away by the early 20th century. Had access to more state ward bodies, improved refrigeration, microbiology and advanced surgery were obviously much more of a thing, x-rays, and dissection, was becoming less important. But there were motives besides cash that remained in play in the world of body snatching. And the most sordid, disturbing example is provided by murderer/body snatcher Ed Gein of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Once Gein's mother died, leaving him alone on the farm. He, from 1947 to 1952, raided cemeteries in order to obtain body parts, from which he made various household and clothing items. I'm not going into detail. Gein died in a mental institution in 1984 at the age of 77. He inspired several of your favorite movie characters, including Norman Bates, Psycho, Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill, Silence of the Lambs. None of these characters, as far as I can tell, even approximates the depth of Ed Gein's depravity. Finally, Amador Medina. He was charged in Worcester Superior Court on 9, we're bringing it closer to home now. 9 counts, disinterring a dead body, disturbing a grave for the theft of skeletal remains from family mausoleums. Medina lived in Hartford. Police came to his apartment to investigate a complaint about the presence there of human remains. Medina told police he was a priest in a religion called Palo Mayombe, which I won't go into except to say it's related to Santeria, and one website that I looked at that details what Palo Mayombe is offers human skulls and bones for sale. Purportedly, they're expensive. Real skulls are expensive. They're even for not a great one, they would get something like $1,400 for it. That's a lot of money. I got mine at Joann's. 75% off. They're like $4. The jaw moves though. So anyway, the police are there, and he said, "I'm a priest in this religion, and I use human remains for religious rituals." And he showed the police a plastic bag on his front porch that contained dirt and human bones. He told them that he had bought the bones from a guy in Massachusetts, and he showed police photos on his phone of open caskets containing human remains. Yes, photos on his phone. This occurred in 2015. And last year, only last year, judge in Worcester Superior Court suppressed virtually all the evidence and statements that Medina made for the police's failure to supply him with the Miranda warning. So that's there for 1966. Medina, though, would likely have faced the death penalty in Massachusetts for obtaining body parts for use as charm or enchantment, if this were the 17th century. We have presumably faced enough death this evening, and so have reached the end. That's kind of a, that one right there. That was kind of a standard thing of showing a guy being hanged on a roof. Hare was Burke was not hanged on a roof. They built a scaffold. There's the guys picking up coffins. That why would you bother?
I see the hook.
See the hook?
Yeah.
There's Knox playing with human hand, bones. Anybody have any questions?
I don't know if you remember Alistair Cook. Remember they
Alistair Cook's body.
bought it selling his bones?
Yeah, well, it wasn't his bones so much as his organs and stuff, yeah. Nobody knows where Cook really got to, Alistair Cook. You watch you're right, you watch Masterpiece Theater all those years ago. Nobody knows where Alistair Cook's various parts ended up, I don't think.
I was a medical salesman. I worked for a company called Beck & Dickinson in the 70s.
Yeah.
And we sold skulls to dental schools.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How much were they?
They weren't that much. They came from India.
Yeah, the ones that you can get from the Macombe thing now are from Haiti.
And also we sold full skeletons.
Articulated skeletons.
Primarily from India.
Anybody have any other questions or grisly things you want to say?
Yeah, how did the cages over the graves protect the bodies from body snatchers?
You can't get in there. It's physical, it's just like a cage that you can't get in. The whole thing is covered up with that.
Couldn't they just lift the cage up?
No, it's very deeply anchored. It's just way too much trouble. As I mentioned, you want to get in there and out of there in about an hour if you can. It's going to take you much longer than that just to get through that cage. People just wouldn't bother. Any other questions? Thank you for coming. Have a happy Halloween.